Sikna Eved Ivri. If you should buy an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, Sheishonim, Yavod, 6 years he should work. In the 7th year he goes out free, chinam, without any payment, meaning he has nothing to the master. The 6 years, whatever the master paid, whether he's satisfied or not, after 6 years, the slave is not beholden to the master whatsoever. It's chinam. Let's see Rashi. There are two types of Jewish slaves. There's a slave that's sold because he stole, and he wasn't able to reimburse the victim who he had victimized, and he sold for his value, whatever his market value is, to reimburse the person who was victimized, or a person falls in the hard times, and he sells himself as an indentured servant. So the Torah says, even if you sell yourself as an indentured servant, you can't set the time period, maximum 6 years. You cannot sell yourself for more than 6 years. The 7th year, the contract is terminated, regardless. It's not a valid sale. If it's more than 6 years, 6 years, it's cut off. So either you're sold as for stealing, and since there's no penal system, this is how you reimburse the victim, or a person sells himself because, as I said, he has to support his family, he has to pay debts, and he sells himself for whatever that value is to pay the debt. Now, the Gemara says something in Kedusha, something interesting. What happens if the person's value is more than the theft? Is he sold? It's not sold. What about if his value is less than the theft? He'll only be able to compensate the victim for part of his loss. It's not sold. He has to be sold. His value has to be exactly the amount of money that the stolen item was worth. It has to be a full reimbursement. There's no excess, there's no less. So what's the reality when a Jewish slave can be sold? Unless he sells himself, that's a different story. He sells himself for a certain price, okay? That's like the equivalent of indentured servant. But to be sold by the court, it's nearly impossible to come up with that scenario. Secondly, the Gemara says that Hakona Eved Latzmo Kona Odon Latzmo. If you buy a Jewish slave, it's buying a master. Why? So the Gemara says that based on the pasuk, that you have to treat him no less than you treat yourself in terms of quality of life. Meaning, the Gemara says, if you have one piece of quality bread, and it's either you or the slave, the Jewish slave, you have to give it to the Jewish slave. If you have one comfortable bed, and it's a question, he sleeps in the bed or you sleep in the bed, and the other person sleeps on the floor, the master sleeps on the floor. You have to treat the slave no less than you treat yourself. So therefore, the Gemara says, if you buy a slave, it's like being foolish because you're actually buying a master, because you have to treat him with kid gloves. Anything less than that, you're failing as a master of a Jewish slave. So the likelihood of a person being sold as a thief. Firstly, do you want a thief in your house? You don't want a thief. He already has a criminal background. There's no penal system, okay? But I'm not going to buy him. Firstly, if he infringes on my life, if a person is phenomenally wealthy, it doesn't make a difference, and he's arm's length from turn him into a farm worker, and he lives in with the workers, okay? But a regular situation, who's going to hire this? Who's going to buy this kind of person? And because it's Hakona Eved Latzmo is Kona Odon Latzmo. Okay. Now the Gemara wants to know. Rashi cites the Chazal Ki Sikna Eved Ivri. Eved Shu Ivri doesn't mean a slave who's a Hebrew. He's a Jew. Oena Ele Eved Shel Ivri. You purchase the slave of a Jew. Eved Kanani Shalochim Yisrael, a Canaanite slave that you purchased from a Jew. And Torah says, if you purchase a Canaanite slave, after 6 years, he must be set free. So, but the Torah says that when you have a Canaanite slave, you pass it down in inheritance to the next generation, the heirs. And here it says he goes out after 6 years. That's when you buy it from a non-Jew. If you buy a Canaanite slave from a non-Jew, then it's yours forever. But if you buy a Canaanite slave from a Jew, he goes out after 6 years. Talmud Loma ki ivri. There's a pasuk in Dvarim ki mochel chicho ivri. Lomarti elo b'chicho. We're speaking achicho, who sold to you? Achicho ivri, your brother who's a slave, who's the slave. So we're speaking about the slave is the Jew, not that the master is the Jew, but the slave is the Jew. So the Torah says in that situation, maximally he cannot be sold more than 6 years. Ki sikneh, when you buy him. Miyad bezdin shebachru b'gnevoso. We're speaking over here. It's called he was sold by the court to compensate the victim for what? For the theft that he had stolen. Shenema im eilo v'nikra b'gnevoso. The Torah says if he doesn't have the means to reimburse, to compensate the one who he stole from, he sold for the theft. Maybe it's speaking about a person who sells himself because of his financial need. But if the court sells him, he doesn't go out for 6 years. In Vayikra, when it speaks about if your brother falters, he falls on hard times, he sells himself. That's speaking bocharatzmo. He sells himself because of his financial hardships. So therefore, in Mishpatim, when it says kisiknem, the nibka bebezin, we speak about a person who was sold by the court to compensate the person who was victimized through the theft. Second, so I mentioned yesterday, Rabbeinu Bachya, why is he referred to as Eved Ivri? The classification of a Jew after Sinai is called Yisrael. Ivri is pre-Sinai. It's a pre-Sinai classification. Post-Sinai classification, we'll call it Yisrael. It should be Kisigna Eved Yisrael. Why is it Ivri? So he explains, because this person, in terms, as we'll see in a moment, because of what he had done, he stole, and now he's sold into slavery. We were told at Sinai, you're not permitted to steal. So evidently, the words of Sinai, or this new status he assumed that Sinai, doesn't resonate. He doesn't sense that value. And as a result of that, he stole. He justified stealing. So therefore, he's still part of the old classification. He's behaving like an Ivri. He's not behaving like Yisrael. Yisrael is what? Is Goy Kodosh. Yisrael is Mamlechus Kohanim. You're a princely, kingly nation. Therefore, the Torah is labeling him, as Ivri. He's not Yisrael. This is Rabbeinu Bachya. Lachovshi, he goes to Cherus. It's interesting. Later we find in Dorim that when you send out a Jewish slave, when he goes out free, you must give him a financial package. Since factually he served you, you have to actually give him a certain amount of money for his years of service. Even though you paid for him, it doesn't make a difference. You have to give him, show your appreciation. I mean, you see something interesting. A person, unfortunately, falls on hard times, sells himself. Person steals, makes a mistake. What does he feel like? He's a criminal and he had no choice. He had to be sold. So actually, what did you do to him? He was actually minimized and taken down. He was treated like a chattel. The Torah says when you send him out, he has to receive a financial package, and you have to give him a certain amount of money, whatever it is, whether it's in sheep and other things, in fruit, but it's a financial package. So you would think he owes you nothing. What about if you treated him exceptionally well? Does he owe you anything? It's the other way. You have to reinstate him. He doesn't have to in any way show anything to you. Unfortunately, whatever he was a slave. But once he goes out, it's like the record is totally cleaned. It's cleaned. He has no criminal record. I mean, people know he stole, but in terms of the master-slave relationship, he's not his master. It's like an unfortunate situation. The Gemara tells us regarding the Jewish slave that, let's say a person, you paid for him, and he's sitting and you have nothing to, no, you have no work to do for him. And you say, but by the way, you say, he cost money. He cost me. You tell him, why don't you clean up the house? The house doesn't need any cleaning. Maybe you should go cook something for me. Doesn't need it. So just to burden him with physical responsibility, that's called abuse. The master is not permitted to do it. Unless it's something which is a need, he needs something, then he's at your beck and call. But if it's just you want to occupy him because you feel you own him, you're not permitted to do it. Because you understand when you, an employee, you can not even permitted to abuse an employee. You're not, so a slave, where here he's been minimized, his whole dignity has been lost. He's being treated, we'll see in a minute, even as a breeder. When he says, I love my wife, could the master give him a Canaanite woman, which normally he's not permitted to? Even before, the master is permitted to give him a Canaanite woman to breed children, and the children aren't even his children, because since she's a Canaanite slave, there's no pedigree. So you know how to what degree he's been reduced. He's been minimized as a human being. He's like dehumanized over here to a degree. And Bagapo Yovo Biapa Yetze. If he came in with his garment, he goes out with his garment. Meaning, as he came, he leaves. What about in Balishu? Let's say he was a married man. He had a family. When he leaves, when he finishes his years of servitude, his wife goes out with him. So Rashi cites the Gemara. What if he is sold to slavery? His wife is somehow bound to the contract of the husband. What is v'yotzi ishtoimo? So again, this even makes it more difficult. We say kona eved lots, kona od lots. When you purchase a slave, it's like buying a master, purchasing a master. You have to support his family. If a man has a family, not only do you have to support him, you have to provide for his family. So when the 6 years come to an end, terminate, you no longer have an obligation to want to support his family. That's what it means. V'yotze ishto imo. That it's terminated, the obligation comes to an end. When he goes out, you no longer have an obligation to him, and you no longer have an obligation to his family. Rashi. He wasn't married. Targumo imul chodoi. Loshin begabo bechnofo shlobo elo kamoshu yichidi besok levusha bekonof nigdo. He came with a shirt on his back. He had nothing other than that. Gaba yetze magid shim lo hayelo isha mit so nose mitchilo a rabba moselo shivcha kananis al korcho. Here, if he doesn't have a wife, the master cannot impose a Canaanite woman on him. Laholid mimed avodim. It's a question of the Gemara. If he's permitted, if he agrees to have the wife, he wants that woman, he needs that companionship, he's permitted. But the master cannot impose that on him. In Balishu, Yisraelis, Yotze Ishtu Imo, B'chi Mihichdisa Shetetze. I mean, she never entered into servitude, that she has to be freed. So what does it mean? She goes out with him without any level of obligation. And the Magid, Hakosuv, Shekone Eved Ivri, Chayev Mzonis Ishtu Banov. When you purchase a Jewish slave, not only do you have to support the slave, you have to support the wife and the family. So, I mean, to a degree, unless that slave has a special ability, you have to be out of your mind to get involved in this. Not only do you have to assume financial responsibility for the person, even for his family, his wife and children. Meaning, when you steal, the person says, I stole. Okay, I'll reimburse the person. Whatever way you justify stealing. The man has so much embezzlement. I'll put the money back in the till. And ultimately, he justifies many things. So a person doesn't take it as he should. You know something? This is the core of your being. This compromises your spirituality. The Jew himself has an obligation, which is at the Gemara Sanhedrin. The mitzvah pruravu is only upon the Jew. A non-Jew has no obligation to procreate. As a Jew has. The pruravu that was said to Adam Rishon only has relevance to the Jew, not to the non-Jew. So the Jew is Adam. We are a representation of God. This is the close thing to ex nihilo. I mean, animals also ex nihilo. But as Adam, we are the Adam. We are God's representation. When you stole, you compromised that profile of Adam. It's not, I stole. It's not the end of the world. No, it is the end of the world. It's at the heart of the issue over here. And therefore, as a result of that, the location which you magnify who you are, that's exactly what was compromised. As a result of that, you sold as a slave and permitted even to this kind of woman that normally you couldn't marry. And the children are not your children like an animal. No, it's animal husbandry. That's about it.
Rabbi,
now, how are we referring to? He sold for 6 years. He starts off as an Eved Ivri. He think after 6 years, he should talk like a rational person. Who should he talk like? It's say, Vim Oma Yomer HaYisrael or Odom. Oma Yomo Eved. This man is still, his mindset, he's Eved. He's talking like a slave. Well, Hafti is Adoni. I love my master. As Ishti, I love my wife. As Bonai, I love my children. Yeah. It's not, you have, your master is God. The woman is not your wife. And your children, we said, are not your children. There's no pedigree here. And he says, Lo Eitzi Chavshi. I'm not interested in going free. I want to remain in this. I want to remain this state. To have the master. V'yigishu Adonov Elo Elohim. The master takes him before the court. V'yigishu Al Delso LaMezuzah. They take him to the door, to the doorpost. V'rotza Adonov Esosno B'matzeya. And the master pierces his ear with an awl, Vavadol Olam. And he becomes a slave forever. Let's see Rashi. El Elohim lebezdin tzorach yimolech b'mochrov shemachrulo. He has to go mention this to what? To sellers who sold him into slavery, the court. El adosel mezuzah. Okay. Let's go next Rashi. V'rotza Adonov Esosno Hayimonius o Edo Elo Shils. Which ear does he pierce? First, he puts it through the cartilage, not through the earlobe. We're not talking about like an earring. This is through the cartilage. Talmud Loma Ozen B'Gzer Shovo Nema Kan V'rotza Adonov Esosno Nema B'Mitzur Tnuch Ozen Hayimonis. The tnuch is not low. It's the cartilage. Ma Lalon Hayimonis Avkani Mos Ma Ro. Now, why do you pierce the ear? It's Gemara Kedushin. Why are you putting a hole through the ear? Why does the Torah choose to put the hole through the ear more than any other part of the body? The ear that heard at Sinai, you're not permitted to steal. And he went and he stole. Teirotza. That ear should be what? Should be pierced. What about if we're speaking about a person who sold himself due to financial hardship? He sold himself as an indentured servant. You are my subjects. And he went, he purchased a master for himself, Tirotza. Meaning there's some kind of faulty hearing mechanism. It didn't resonate sufficiently. As they said, you don't get it. Rabbi Shimon Hoyo, why does the Torah say you pierce the ear by the doorpost, which has a door? The door and the doorpost that were witnesses in Egypt. He had the blood of the Korban Pesach on the lintel and the two doorposts. But Marti, and the reason why I skipped over the homes of the Jews, Kili b'nei Yisrael avodim, the b'nei Yisrael my subjects, avodehem v'lavodim lavodim. They're my subjects. They're not subjects of subjects. This man went and purchased a master for himself. He wrote up b'fneim. That ear should be what? Pierced in the presence of that doorpost and the lintel. Va'avodu l'olam, he's a slave forever. What's forever? Ada yovel. Oeinu elu l'olam, maybe it means he's forever. He never goes out free. Talmud lo v'isham mishpachto toshuvu. It says later that when Yovel comes, all slaves, even though they were pierced, they go back to their families. Magchim chamishim shona kruim olam. 50 years, the Jubilee, and that means that's forever. V'lo sheyeh ovdo kol chamishim shona. He doesn't have to work 50 years. Elo ovdo ada Yovel. Whenever the Yovel should come. Person sold 2 years before the Jubilee year, Yovel comes, he's free. 20 years later, he's freed. Whenever the Jubilee comes, he's free. Bein somach, bein muflog, he's quoted the Mar Kedusha. Now, the question is this. Firstly, if the reason why you pierced the ear is because whatever he heard at Sinai, it didn't resonate with him, and he has some kind of faulty component in himself, so the moment he steals, why don't you put the all through his ear immediately? Right? Or he sells himself into slavery. Don't you understand who you are? It's only if after 6 years where he had the experience and he still doesn't wake up, we say now this guy has a problem. He has a problem. Meaning initially, you say, people, we talk about like make mistakes, temporary insanity. That's what it is. But after you've been in this state for 6 years and you've been stewing in this brew, how do you say, I want to continue? Now it's confirmed you really don't get it. You don't get it. And despite Sinai, you don't get it. That means you have a faulty mechanism here. To indicate that, you put the hole through his ear. That's the understanding. Now, the question is, why is Yovel called L'olam? He's a slave forever. Forever. He's a slave until the Jubilee year. What are we referring to forever? So it's interesting. The Ramchal writes that every 7 days, we have a cycle, 6 day, 7 day, Shabbos. 6 day, you engage in the mundane. Shabbos is L'Hashem Elokecha. 7th day is for God. Even Ochel Nefesh is not permitted. Food-related activity, Shabbos is not permitted. Rameir Simcha says that what's the difference between Shabbos and Yom Tiv? Shabbos is Bein Oton Lamokom. That's to reestablish, to refocus on our relationship with Hashem. Yom Tiv is Bein Oton L'Chavero. That's the reason why we're permitted in food-related activities. Fresh food, we're permitted to transport from domain to domain to solidify our relationships within Klal Yisrael. That's Bein Oton L'Chavero. But Shabbos is Shabbos L'Hashem. That's how Reb Meir Simcha explains. It's Shabbos designated exclusively for Hashem. So he explains, as a human being, whatever we're involved in, it compromises us. So let's say for 6 days you're involved in mundane, even though every day you pray, you put on tefillin, you learn, you say Kriya Shema, but when you're involved in the mundane, it has its effect. Every Shabbos, which is Me'ein Olam Haba, when you experience the Shabbos as you're supposed to, you're actually resetting the balance. You regain your spiritual equilibrium on Shabbos. That's what Shabbos is. This is the Ramchal. Therefore, it's always 6. When it comes 7, you get an infusion of spirituality. You have the sabbatical year. 6 years, the land, you work the land, and you're involved from dawn to dusk in what? In the physical. Now you have to take a sabbatical year. A whole year, you don't work. You don't work the land. It's Shabbos L'Hashem, same idea. It's, as the Siforno over there explains, it's for meditation and for studying Torah. It's a year of what? Of spiritual immersion for a year. To regain your balance. So a person, once you cross that line and you violate you go into the 7th year, you're permanently damaged. You're at a point of no return. You've compromised your spirituality. You need that infusion on the 7th year. And therefore, it's only a temporary situation. You still could regain and be reinstated. Once you cross the 6th year and go into the 7th year, it's Avodah L'Olam. Even though the Jubilee year is just the next year, it doesn't make a difference. Once you've gone beyond 6, now it's L'Olam. That defect, that effect of what you did, compromises you forever. You can never regain what you lost. That's the understanding. That's why the Jubilee year is referred to Avodah L'Olam. You're a slave forever for that reason. Kohen cannot be sold as a slave, as a Jewish slave, even if he steals. Falls into hard times, he can't sell himself for financial reasons. Because the Gemara says that every slave was sold as a slave. If he wants to remain beyond 6 years, that's his prerogative. But however, when the Yovel comes, he goes back to the family. It says, Yushavel Mishpachto. But if a slave says, after 6 years, I love my master, my wife, my children, the Torah says he's there till Jubilee, but you have to pierce his ear. And then he returns, he's reinstated. A Kohen, the moment you put that hole through his cartilage of his ear, he becomes blemished. He cannot go back to his original status. He's become blemished. So because he's become blemished, therefore you can't sell. You can only sell a slave for 6 years if he has the alternative to go beyond 6. But since the Kohen cannot go beyond 6, because it goes beyond 6, he becomes a Balmum. As a result of that, you can't sell him even for the 6 years. You understand? Meaning, it's a total compromise. Shave it, the Kohanim, that's the spiritual core of the Jewish people. That's the relationship with Hashem is through the Kohen. He's the intermediary. That cannot be touched. And if, as we said, what is the piercing the? It's avadul olo. That's a total compromise on his spirituality. He can never be reinstated. Meaning the hole in the ear is only indication that it's permanent. That's avadul olo. A Kohen cannot be avadul olo. We don't give him that prerogative. As a result of that, he can't be sold. Because that is the essence, that's the core of the spirituality of the Jewish people. He's the intermediary between us and Hashem.
Rabbi,
Just add to it. The Mishnah Berurah in the laws of Nesis Kapayim quotes the Rambam, that even if a Kohen is a Rasha, does he qualify for Birchas Kohanim? It's not a Shomer Shabbos. Does he qualify for Birchas Kohanim? Do you want a blessing from that kind of person? So the Rambam says the Kohen is not the one who gives you the blessing. He's only the conduit for the blessing. That when he opens his fingers, it's like the window through his fingers, because he has a certain representation. Through him, the bracha, he's the conduit. The bracha comes through him, but he's not the blesser. When he gives the blessing, then Hashem says, I will give the blessing. But it's not his blessing that gives it its value. It's Hashem. So you see, the Kohen is essential, and that status cannot be compromised. If he becomes blemished, you've compromised it. Therefore, you can't even be sold for the 6 years.
So, Rabbi, somebody picks up the tab for the Kohen, basically, if he's